All right, so our objectives for today, for this morning, are to understand how to access maps for use in the classroom and understand ways to use maps with students of varying ages, interests, and skill levels. And participants who successfully complete the session will be able to submit their information for I think 2 CTLE credits upon completion of the evaluation survey at the end of the session. Again, that'll come at the end of the session. Don't worry. We will make sure to share the link for you to fill in your information for getting CTLE credits. And let's look at the next slide now with our agenda. So we're on that beginning portion, welcome and some housekeeping announcements. And then after I wrap up with these housekeeping items here at the beginning, I'll pass it over to my colleague Julia, who's going to run an icebreaker. And then I will introduce you all to Maggie and Laura, who are going to introduce us to the MAPS portal and run a little map scavenger hunt. We love any excuse for a scavenger hunt. And then Julia and I are going to talk more about using maps in the classroom and model an activity that helps us use maps as a reflective tool. All right, so I also want to mention we will be sharing supplemental materials for today's lesson through links in the chat. And we'll also send that material to you via email in follow-up. So if you forget to save one of those links to an item that we look at, don't worry, we'll send it again after. You'll notice that we have muted all of the participants in order to prevent unintentional audio feedback and disruptions during today's program. So we strongly encourage you to use the chat feature to share your ideas, comments, and questions. Staff will closely monitor the chat and be on hand to provide technical assistance, to offer clarification, and to respond to any concerns. We'll also use the chat feature to share resources referenced in the presentation as we go, and to collect any questions that we don't get to during the presentation to make sure we answer them afterwards. You can access the chat feature by clicking on the chat icon down at the bottom of your Zoom window. And there will be some moments during the presentation as well where we just pause to check for questions. And let's look at the next slide. If you haven't done so already, you can add your name and pronouns to your profile. You can do this by clicking on the participant icon on the bottom of the window. Find and hover over your name when the participants list then appears on the right side of your window. And when you hover over your name, you'll see a rename button appear. When you click on that, you'll have the option to type your full name as well as your pronouns. For instance, they, them, she, her, or he, him. Let's look at the next slide. And we're really committed to ensuring all of our events, activities, and materials are accessible to all individuals, including individuals with disabilities. So closed captioning is available during today's session and can be enabled by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Please email our staff with your preferred communication method at connections@bklynlibrary.org if you require any other accessibility accommodations. And then lastly, we want you to be aware that this session is being recorded and will be shared after the session concludes. So by participating with your camera on, you've consented to being recorded. If you do not consent to being recorded, please feel free to turn your camera off and refrain from verbally sharing ideas, comments, and questions out loud. You can share these through the chat, which will not be saved. And we will have a short breakout session activity today. Breakout sessions will also not be recorded. Let's look at our next slide. Our events here are intended to create a space that nurtures a community of educators and that is inclusive of everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, sexual orientation, ability, or stage of professional development. All attendees are expected to show respect to presenters, organizers, and other attendees. Again, please reach out if you need help. You can use the chat feature if you have a technology issue, if you want to clarify something, or if you have concerns about another participant's behavior. And you can also privately message staff by looking for co-host beside our name in the participants list, and then sending a chat message just to us. So we are going to get started now with an icebreaker led by my colleague Julia, and I'm going to turn things over to Julia.
Okay, thank you so much, Jen. Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all warm and cozy. We are going to do a lot of amazing activities today, so I'm so excited that you guys are here. So like Jen said, my name is Julia Pelez, and I'm one of the educators for the Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library. I am so excited that I get to spend the morning with all of you talking about some essential skills that will help us understand the importance of incorporating maps and map analysis skills into our classroom activities and curriculum. But before I get ahead of myself, let's start off with a super easy icebreaker. So if we can go to the next slide, that would be amazing. Perfect. So again, please feel free to share your answers and your thoughts in the chat, but let's just start off with our first question. So if you had to explain to someone why maps are useful, what would you suggest that they were used for? Okay, so we have some answers coming in the chat. So we have navigation, visualizing history, visual representations of an environment, a visual guide. Ooh, these answers are wonderful. To get to a place. Oh, these are wonderful. Understanding history, geographical context, finding your way in an unfamiliar place. You guys are coming through with amazing responses. Navigation, location, perfect. So yes, all of your answers are correct and wonderful. Thank you so much. So like you guys are all saying in the chat, maps are super useful and helpful with things like finding stuff, navigation, route planning, right? They can also help us understand specific details, not only about a time period, but about a neighborhood, but they could also give us information and details about local environments, right? That go all the way down to the specifics of street names and other forms of information. So let's talk about how maps actually accomplish that. Well, maps accomplish this by displaying symbolic and artistic depictions of a desired location, right? So we will be getting into how we can specifically unpack all of these characteristics through understanding and actually implementing certain research skills. So that's what we're going to be doing later on today. But let's kind of dive into our second icebreaker activity. So our second question is, if you had to make a map of your home, what would be the 3 most important things that you would include? And again, you could put that in the chat. So if you had to make a map of your home, what would be the 3 most important things that you would include? So some answers are bathroom, kitchen, bed. I would include my windows, bathroom, and kitchen. The exit, I like that. The fire escape. Bathroom, kitchen, exit, location of diapers. We have, I'm liking the theme of the kitchen, my favorite room. We have the refrigerator, the bed, the fire escape. These are perfect responses. I would definitely say I would include my bed, my kitchen, and my plant room. So perfect. You guys gave me some amazing responses. So like I said before, we're going to be diving in some amazing maps today. So we're actually going to be exploring a map that was created in 1770. And in order to understand this map, which is known as the Ratzer map, we want to practice some important document analysis skills that will help us piece together what's actually happening and going on in the Ratzer map. So these skills and these vocabulary terms that we are going to be learning will help us collectively analyze the map through the same lens and terminology, which is always so important. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. Perfect. So let us talk about the first skill that we are going to be reviewing. Now, this skill is super fun, and it's one of my favorite, literally because of its easy nature. So our first kind of term is going to be an observation, right? So an observation is something that we see. Now, our next term is an inference. Now, inferences will build off of your observations, right? So an inference is something that you think based off what you see, right? And finally, while we're doing a source analysis, we always want to ask questions, right? So what else would we want or like to know about the source that we're looking at, right? So now that these three skills that focus on things that we see, focus on things that we think, and the questions that we have will help us understand the source that we're going to be looking at, like the map, but in an organized and scaffolded way, which is what we always want to do. We always want to do our source document analysis in a very scaffolded and organized way. So now that we've reviewed these terms, let's actually dive into the map from 1770. So before we do that, later on, our amazing colleagues are actually going to show you how to access our map portal. But for right now, the map that we're going to be discussing, we're going to be putting it in a link in our chat. So just so that you guys know, you can click on the link and you can click on the map, and that will be able to allow you guys to zoom in and out. But since we do want to focus on Brooklyn, in order to see the Brooklyn section of the Ratzer map, we are going to be including a Padlet link that, again, Charlie is going to be sharing in the chat. We will be using this Padlet link to record our observations, inferences, and questions. In order to record your answers in the Padlet link, you can double click anywhere to post your answers. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes to click on the Padlet link to make your observations and inferences and questions, and then we'll review and discuss our answers. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please put it in the chat and we will help you guys out.
And we're just going to pull that Padlet up on the screen here so we can all take a look at it together. And you can see this Padlet lets us look at just a portion of the map. Awesome. Thanks for pulling that up, Charlie. And we can scroll down to see everyone's observations. Amazing.
Oh, you guys are doing great so far. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few more moments. Okay, so let us go over some of your answers. So we have some answers that say, I see Wallabat Bay. We have a question that is saying, what are the weird circular shapes? We have, I infer that these are farms. I see road to Jamaica. I see New York City. I see a bay. I see Governor's Island. I see a road. I'm observing no bridges. This is all great, guys. Let's see what else. Inference, the map was created before bridges were built. Question, how did they get across the water? These are all amazing. So what I would like to say, based on all of your observations, so I see another observation came in that says, I see a stream. These are all wonderful. I see boundary lines. It looks less occupied. These are all wonderful. Thank you guys so much for all of your responses. This is great. And I always love to use a Padlet. This is like so awesome. So I think that it's super important to talk about the fact that you guys didn't have any background knowledge or content knowledge about the source in order to start analyzing it and ultimately understanding and breaking apart what the Ratzer map was telling you. So you guys did a fantastic job about that, right? And it should be known that when we start to analyze a document, we start to analyze the document, we start piecing together our observations, we start piecing together our inferences. The document is going to be providing us with questions, and those questions will then foster and lead us to further our inquiry and discovery, right? Which is what we always want our students to be taking part in. We want them to be curious. We want them to discover, right? And again, this process empowers our students to seek out the content knowledge, right? And it furthers their curiosity rather than us just giving them the content knowledge and kind of projecting the information onto them, right? So again, we want them to kind of go out and discover these answers through themselves, for themselves. So I'm gonna end this section with just a question that you guys can reflect upon yourself, but what might this map have been used for, right? So why was it created? So this is something that you can just think about over the next few minutes while we're kind of diving into some of our other activities. But thank you guys so much for participating. You guys did an amazing job, and I'm gonna hand things over to Jen, who's gonna take it from there.
Super. Thanks, Julia. And I want to just point one thing out about the Padlet. The map that that image was from is massive. And the first link that we shared in the chat would let you explore the whole map. We'll be talking a little bit later about how to make maps a little less overwhelming for students. And we found that Padlet a really great way to share just a portion of it, because it became the background of the Padlet when we uploaded it as the background. And it made it so that students, if we're doing this with students, wouldn't have to deal with all of the entirety of the map. They could just look at the background section. So thank you, Julia. I now want to hand things over to Maggie and Julia. Maggie Schreiner is the Collections and Digital Access Manager at the Center for Brooklyn History. And Maggie previously worked in several capacities at New York University Libraries and is the Outreach Coordinator for Queens Memory at Queens Public Library. Schreiner holds a BA from McGill University and an MA in Archives and Public History from New York University, where she now serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Archives and Public History program. And Laura Giuliano is an MA student at New York University, obtaining her degree in Archives and Public History. Laura previously worked at the Brooklyn Historical Society as the MAPS assistant, as well as a collections assistant, and worked as a graduate research assistant at the Special Collection Library at NYU. Laura holds a BA from the College of New Jersey. Take it away, Maggie.
Thanks, Jen. We can go to the next slide. So Laura and I are gonna talk a little bit about the process of creating what we call our map portal, which is a interface that we built at Center for Brooklyn History to provide digital access to over almost 2,000 of our maps with geolocations. So to contextualize this collection, at the Center for Brooklyn History, we hold a wide variety of research materials. So we hold over 1,600 different archival collections. So those are materials, diaries of people, correspondence, papers of organizations from throughout Brooklyn history. We hold tens of thousands of photographs. And in addition to those materials, we hold over 2,000 maps and atlases that date from the 17th century to almost the present. About 2015, I think, is our most recent map. And together, these materials and these maps in particular really document the transition of Brooklyn from 6 agricultural towns to a center of manufacturing and to New York City's most populous borough. So the maps, some of the strengths and the stories that we can really tell through these maps are the process of transition from agriculture to manufacturing, the municipal development of Brooklyn, the way that land use has changed in Brooklyn throughout the centuries, and the development of infrastructure, particularly transit. So together, these maps really reveal the complex ways that Brooklyn became intertwined with New York City over the centuries, but yet continues to have the distinct identity of Brooklyn as a borough. So you can go to the next slide. So 4 years ago, in 2017, what was then Brooklyn Historical Society, which was a precursor to the Center for Brooklyn History, was awarded a large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize our entire map collection, geolocate them, which means add the location data, and display these maps online. We decided to focus on flat maps, so not maps that were bound in atlases for this project. And partially that was just because, as you can imagine, it's much easier to work with maps that are already flat and not bound in terms of digitization. And that in itself was a very large project. So we tried to create a map portal or online interface that would be really low cost and designed to meet the needs of our users. So we used the WordPress platform, and we built a custom plugin that allows us to display the maps and the descriptive information about each map alongside each other. So Laura is going to discuss a little bit about sort of the work that went into creating this and some of the technology that we use to create this system.
Thanks, Maggie. You can go to the next slide. So I was hired as the MAPS project assistant in 2018. The project was based on our extensive collection of flat and folded maps through conservation, digitization, and the creation of the portal that we are looking at today. Before I was hired, the team had accomplished a lot of the prep work, obtained the grant funding, and created the timeline and vision for the map portal and the finished project. And it was led in large part by the library manager at the time, Julie May, who really had this vision for the portal. Sorry. So the physical workflow of creating this digitization was, the first step was assessing our folded and flat maps, ensuring that they were eligible to be digitized. Each map was appraised for fragility, how many pieces it was in, the condition of the paper, if there were hardcovers or booklets, and if they were able to be handled and moved without damage. If they were eligible for digitization, they were encapsulated in Mylar and added to the list of maps to be put on the portal. I encapsulated a lot of the maps, which took a long time, but we also had a lot of help doing that because this was a large part of the physical workflow that we had to do in the beginning. Our cataloger was in charge of checking copyright for each map to determine if they were in the public domain or not. And then after assessment, I assigned each map a file name, a barcode, and attached this all to a call number, which I kept track of in an Excel spreadsheet. You can go to the next slide. Another big part of the workflow was capturing the geographic information of each map. I used an open source software program called Bounding Box. I would find the location of the map in Bounding Box, create a corresponding location, copy and paste the data into the spreadsheet I was using, and then use that data to upload into our system. This was made more difficult by the maps in our collection. There are some maps that are just cross streets that don't have names, maps that are of roads that no longer exist, or are old neighborhoods that look completely different today. Our cataloger was immensely helpful during this process because she had a lot of information about 19th century Brooklyn that I just did not, and she helped really make it so that I could get a general sense of where the map was in modern times, even if I couldn't get the exact cross streets. And you can see this geolocation now on the bottom half of each map in the portal. And the portal displays the modern map with the box overlay. And it's more of a general guide than an exact location to give you a understanding of where the historical map is. The next thing I did was place each map in a box to be shipped off, keeping track of which maps went in which boxes, to keep track of the 1,500 maps we had, to ensure nothing was lost or damaged in the process. There were about 30 boxes shipped to the vendor in about 4 batches. And when the maps came back, I had to check to make sure each map was in the same condition that it left, that nothing was missing, and I had to put them back in their drawers, in their flat file drawers as well. The digitization vendor we used was Innovative Document Imaging in New Jersey, IDI. They used a mix of overhead scanners for medium to small size maps and a large rolling scanner for our oversized maps. At the same time, we hired a professional photographer to come on site and photograph the maps that were too fragile to send off or too large to be put through the rolling scanner. So the photographer came twice, and each photo session required a lot of prep work and it was time consuming to do it correctly. So the entire process of digitization took 8 months from start to finish. And within this time, we were also able to conserve 10 maps with a conservator in New York City who restored them to their former glory and really saved these maps for posterity. You can go to the next slide. So now that we had 1,600 maps digitized with high-res images to use on our portal, we had to now take the raw data that we had and turn it into something that was useful. So through the work of our cataloger, digital archivist, and my own raw data, we had to create a cohesive set of information that could be uploaded onto the internet. So using Microsoft Excel, we converted the raw geographic data and metadata into machine-readable data, uploaded these into our archival software to create XML data, which was fed into our storehouse to be used by our developers. So we took the images created by digitization, fed them into the portal, and matched the images with their data sets on their predetermined file names and IDs. And as you can understand, this is a large set of data, so it was a little unwieldy. There were a couple hiccups and roadblocks because manipulating large data sets requires a lot of QA, IT professionals, and a team that can handle a lot of double checking of large numbers. And Maggie was integral to this portion of the project, and she really made sure that the data we had was clean and usable. So the team worked with the developers with this data and to create the portal's interface and the front end design to show with the functionality would work with the data sets and really created the front end visualization that you see now with the portal. So that was kind of how we got from A to Z. And I'm going to turn you back over to Maggie, who will demonstrate the culmination of all these years of hard work by many hands.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen and we will go on a tour of the portal together. And I'll show you the functionality that you'll be using for the scavenger hunt. So let me just, are you seeing? Okay, great. So this is the landing page of the map portal, mapcollections.brooklynhistory.org. The link is in the chat if you want to follow along. And there's a few different ways that we can start exploring and learning about the material on this website. So one of the first ways that you can start looking is if you scroll down, we've sort of preset a number of topics that you can start browsing maps. So we have Brooklyn neighborhoods, Queens neighborhoods, public transit maps, natural environment maps that are showing the evolution of Brooklyn from forests, fields, rivers. We have maps that show the development and land use in Brooklyn, and then we have maps that show different kinds of leisure spaces in the borough. So if we click on a topic, we can see this is just a simple browse where we can scroll through. Really, these are any maps where our data has said that in some ways these are leisure maps. So we can see we have a user's guide to the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. We have biking maps. We have driving maps, reading hotspots in New York City. So this is just, if one of these topics piques your interest on the homepage, this is just a place where you can start exploring. So returning to the homepage, another way that we can explore is by using keyword search. So we can go here to this keyword search bar. And if we have a specific topic that we're interested in learning more about, that's where we can look. So we're going to search ferry. And this maybe comes up with looking at the map without bridges and how people got around. So when we search ferry, we can see that we've pulled up 156 records, that in some way these maps have been labeled by past librarians and catalogers as maps that involve ferries. So we can just scroll down and do that sort of browse type examination of these images and titles. But we can also start sort of refining our results using these facets on the left-hand side. So one thing we can do is facet by location. So if we open this, we'll see that we have a link of all the locations that these maps are tagged with. And it's a fair number. So let's say that we want to just see maps with ferries that are showing Bay Ridge. So we can click that, and then we've refined our results, and now we have just 3 maps. So these maps all depict different elements of Bay Ridge, and in some way are showing ferries. If we don't want to look at Bay Ridge anymore, we can simply unselect it using this left-hand checkbox. We can also search by subject. So you can see here, we have many different subjects where these maps are showing both ferries and, say, bus lines, cycling, golf. We won't refine now because we've already really chosen our subject, which is ferries. We can also refine by date. So we can see, we can look at 19th century ferry maps. So we're refining, we have 115 maps from the 19th century. But alternately, we can also say that we're interested in seeing ferry maps from the 21st century. So here we can see these are our more modern cycling maps. And I suspect MTA maps some MTA maps. A final way that we can refine our results is by map genre. And this is really the type of map. So we can look at, we have public utility maps, road maps, historical maps, and that means not just a map that is from the past, but a map that when it was made was depicting something even further in the past. And for instance, we have manuscript maps. So manuscript maps are hand-drawn maps. So these aren't maps that are printed, but were made by hand. So we can click that and we can see a selection of maps that are hand-drawn or perhaps have hand notations. If we want to start over, we can also clear our filters. And we're back set to 0. So we haven't done any searches now. I just want to point out one thing before we start exploring a single page, is that you can use these filters without doing a keyword search first. So say I am interested in Bay Ridge, but I want to see any Bay Ridge map, not just ferry maps. So I can scroll down to Bay Ridge, select that, and then say I'm not just interested in ferries, but I am interested in railways. So now I can see 2 maps. My results are 2 maps that are depicting Bay Ridge and railways. So I haven't done a keyword search at all. I've simply used the filtering functionality on the left-hand side. So we also want to be able to look at the maps in more detail, so we can do some of this close reading. So we can click on the map. Will load. And so I'll just give you a tour through some of the key features of what a single page looks like. So first, and very importantly, we have our map image and title and date. If it's a multi-page map, of which there's several, you'll be able to page through the different images of the different pages of the map. in this interface. This is a single page map, so we don't have that. We can also zoom in if we want to look at it at close, and that allows us to, we can flip our map so it's right side up, and then we can use these buttons to zoom right in and start touring around. So this is where we can really see some of these details of what this map looks like and what it's telling us. We can exit out using the X on the upper right, and then scrolling down, this is a long map, so it's a long scroll. We can see we have a blurb about what the map is and what it's showing us. We have the geolocation information that Laura was telling us. This is the bounding box that tells us where the map is depicting in our modern maps of Brooklyn. We have subjects, different subjects and place names. And then at the bottom, we have more detailed information about the map. So its size, the person who created the map. You can click here to download a low resolution image. We can see here that the map is in the public domain. We can see the full citation. And then finally, one of the last things we can do is these are all hyperlinks. So if I'm interested in railways or railroads, I can click this link. And that will bring me to all the maps on our map portal that depict railways. So that's sort of a tour through the main functionality of the portal. And now that we've done that, I think we'll move on and start thinking about our scavenger hunt. So we'll be sharing a link to our scavenger hunt questions in the chat. I'm also going to pull it up here.
Can I ask a quick question that you
For sure.
may or may not be able to answer? So I acknowledge that I'm putting you on the spot, but we just had a really great question in the chat. Who are New York City map makers through the years? Is this an industry, a skill that developed? Do you have anything to share about that?
I do not have any specific knowledge about the history of map making in New York City, so I can only guess that it's probably both an industry and individual skills that have developed over the years. But I don't know, Laura, do you know more about that?
I think you're right. It's both an industry and a skill. A lot of the maps in our collection, the manuscript maps, the hand-drawn maps, are from the Bergen family, who's in the 19th century spent a lot of time going through Brooklyn and doing the hand-drawn work of letting us know what was happening in Brooklyn at the time. And that was where a lot of the old neighborhoods were documented. So a lot of the old manuscript maps that we have are from the Bergen family. But of course, the people who made maps are far flung.
Yeah, and I would say like a difference between, maps that we encounter in our everyday life now and the maps that are on this portal are, now most of the maps that we encounter are, professionally printed, created by big organizations like the MTA, whereas this portal, the vast majority of the maps are from the 18th and 19th century, and many of them are hand-drawn. And those maps were people who were selling their property or buying property and making notes to understand what the financial transaction was for, and people who were surveying and laying out roads and grids. So many of these maps were not sort of final polished versions that we might see today, but were, hand-drawn. Maybe they were final maps for a property transaction, but maybe it was just a note, really a visual note that someone was making for themselves.
Thank you, Maggie and Laura. And this makes me think, as you're sharing some of these ideas, the question Julia left us with at the end of the icebreaker was, why do you think this map was made? And in the activity that I lead later, we're also going to be thinking about why some specific maps were made. And I think those questions of why maps were made are tied very closely to who then makes them. So let's keep thinking about this. And yeah, and then Maggie said, next thing we're doing is the scavenger hunt, and the link is going in the chat for some scavenger hunt questions. So there it is.
Great. So I'll also show it on my screen. So we're going to do a scavenger hunt where you'll work through these 5 questions using the map portal. We're going to put you in breakout rooms. So you can do these questions individually, but use each other's resources to talk through. If you're having trouble finding something or thinking of ideas, you'll have the support of a group to do this work. So the questions that we're going to look at are, find a map that depicts your favorite Brooklyn neighborhood. Then find a map that depicts a specific Brooklyn block or location. What's one way that your favorite neighborhood or block has changed over time? And the next question is, what is one thing you can learn about New York in the 1700s from a map? Question 3 is, where was Ebbets Field? Find a map that shows how you might have traveled there from your home. Question 4 is, what do cadastral maps show us? So that's a genre of map. Find an example of a hand-drawn or manuscript cadastral map. And the last question is, an 1861 plan proposed a very different Prospect Park from the place that we know today. What was the name of the engineer who created the 1861 design? So you'll have 10 minutes to answer these questions, but it's not a competition, so you don't need to hurry to complete everything. You just, I encourage you to take your time and really use these questions to start exploring the map portal and getting comfortable using it. We'll come back together as a group and answer any additional questions before heading into the next portion of the session. And if you have any questions once you're in your breakout rooms, we'll be popping into the different rooms to check in. So we'll be seeing you shortly. Are we all back?
Coming back. Margaret, I see your comment in the chat. That was hard. Thank you for working at it and trying. We will talk a little bit, Julia and I will talk a little bit in a few minutes about how using maps can be hard and how we can make it easy for students.
So I think we just want to take a couple minutes to see if there are any questions. And if you had any finds you're really excited about, feel free to put them in a chat or put a link to a map in the chat that you were particularly excited about. But if anyone does have any specific questions about using the map portal or anything else that came up during your scavenger hunt, now is the time, and you can put those questions in the chat.
And Mignon, I see your comment that it was really interesting, but we need more time. We totally understand that, like, when we do things like this, if I were to do this in the classroom, we would spend at least a class period doing kind of a scavenger hunt. And we hope that any of the ideas we share today, you can take and kind of use it at the pace that works well for your students. And LaTanya, thanks so much for sharing a link to one of your favorite maps in the chat. Tori asked, why don't more map makers orient their maps according to the cardinal directions? It was very confusing when maps were not oriented properly. I agree.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the fact that there's so many sort of informal and early maps that, you know, the cardinal directions, we are accustomed to that in our modern map making and publishing of maps. And so many of these maps are not modern and not published per se. So we just have a lot of different practices and different degrees of like formal map making practices reflected in these materials. But yeah, that's why we added that rotate button, because it is hard. Can you layer maps? We can't in this tool. That's not functionality that we built in. Maybe you could do that yourself by downloading a bunch of maps and being fancy. But yeah, that's not something that we built in.
That makes me think of like the really good old school overhead projectors and how amazing they would be for like printing maps on transparencies and layering them. If anyone's got some transparencies and an overhead around, you're set. Kelly mentioned using land features to find what they're looking for. Red hook sticks out. Totally, I agree. Sometimes using land features for a park for a map from after the 1860s, using Prospect Park is a great way to orient yourself. But Amber mentioned that some parks no longer exist or have changed names. Tori mentioned when I accessed the maps on my phone before the session started, I could rotate the maps using my fingers and was not restricted to 90 degree rotations. Is there a way to do that on my computer?
There is not. I didn't actually know that about the mobile version, so that is quite exciting. But yeah, I don't think that there's any way to do that on your computer unless maybe you have a touch screen also on your computer. And a couple people I see have already mentioned NYPL's Map Warper. So that's a tool that NYPL developed that does allow you to do layering functionality with maps. So people can check it out. There's a couple links in the chat to that. So I think maybe Jen and Julia, you could take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much, Maggie. And yeah, we're gonna move on to talking about maps in the classroom, and I will let Julia get started with that.
Perfect. Okay. So let me just start off by saying that I am super excited that we get to speak on the access of incorporating maps into the classroom, because I don't actually think that a lot of people talk about or a lot of people realize the complexities of maps as classroom sources. So maps, as we've been discussing throughout the entire morning, are crucial and vital tools that teach important literacy skills to our students, which is amazing. And that's really what we want. We want to teach those map literacy skills. We want our students to discover, be curious, and have all of these kind of amazing experiences with maps. Again, they have the power to instill agency, curiosity, and discovery, right? But maps also have the power to be super overwhelming and overstimulating sources that can actually hinder students' ability to connect with the given information, right? So over the next few minutes, we're going to be reviewing some of the pros and cons of using maps in the classroom. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so some of the pros, right, are, again, like what we've been saying, map literacy is a super important skill, and we really want to kind of reinforce that our students are learning that, right? Visual learners may connect with maps. Comparing historic maps provide, again, a way to kind of start that conversation about change over time, what was happening, right? And last but not least, on our kind of pros list is looking at maps of places that we live in gives students an opportunity to explore their own identity and connection with a place, which again is wonderful, right? But now let's talk about the cons of using maps in the classroom. And I'm going to be personally speaking from my own experience as someone who has numerous learning disabilities. And I'm briefly going to be talking about some of the anxieties and frustrations that I felt and actually continuously feel while using maps and activities that aren't really scaffolded towards the way that I process and learn information. So that's what we're going to be discussing. So when it comes to dealing with maps, students are actually asked and required to do so much, right? So they're required to compute, manipulate, translate all of this information in such a short amount of time, right? So whether it's an icebreaker activity or a do now, and I know that you guys were kind of feeling those anxieties in our last kind of exercise, right? We were asking so much of you. Right. Sometimes the skills that the students need to be confident are knowing specific vocabulary terms. Students also need to follow numerous steps of an activity or an assignment. Maps can also include small fonts. They can include cursive. They can include numerous overwhelming colors and color combinations. And it could also require the students to have spatial awareness. And on top of that, if all of these things are difficulties, also working alongside a partner could also add kind of another layer of anxieties as well. So like group work with maps can also be stressful as well. As someone with dyslexia, I struggle with things like reading, following multi-step instructions, staying on task without getting distracted. I easily get confused when it comes down to what symbolic representations should mean, right? I have always struggled with time pressures that lead to anxieties, and that is always the case when it comes down to actually reading and using maps with confidence, right? So again, when I look at maps, I instinctively get overstimulated and overwhelmed, and that's kind of my emotional response. And that's why I don't really use them in the typical way in my personal life, right? And I was really never taught how to break down, how to analyze, and how to systematically understand the importance of a map and how to incorporate and use map literacy skills until I was an adult, right? So that's why when we are incorporating these maps into our classroom, we always want to have this consciousness of these silent and invisible variables, right, that we might not even think about when we're making these activities and when we're incorporating them into our curriculum, right? We want to make sure that all of our students have the same foundation and that together they are working towards gaining the same literacy skills on how to analyze these maps and these sources together, right? So later when Jen does her activity and she's going to be talking about the different kinds of maps that we have, I personally associate with our illustrated maps, and we have a lot of great examples of illustrated maps, and I love them. They're wonderful, right? And I identify with illustrated maps usually on how they present their information, right? There are going to be less details on an illustrated map. Illustrated maps will usually have less text. They'll have bigger fonts. They'll have less colors and color variations. And it's most likely going to be in the one that we'll look at less crowded, right? So I'm going to hand it over to Jen because I can talk about maps all day. But this is just something that I want you guys to start to think of, that yes, maps are super, super important. We want to reinforce these skills, right? But we also have to be conscious of the anxieties that go about and that come along with these sources, right? So I will stop for now, but let's dive into some maps.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Julia. And as Julia and I had a conversation about this and about making maps accessible and understanding different accessibility needs for maps in our classroom, it was really eye-opening for me. And so we wanted to talk through on these next slides a couple of types of maps to consider. Julia has been talking about illustrated or pictorial maps. This first one has extensive detail. We actually looked at only the Brooklyn section of it on our Padlet at the start, and even that tiny portion of it had a lot of detail. But as a pictorial map, it's really focused on showing pictures of what things look like. It's not showing us the topography. It's not showing us all the roads or transportation systems. It's showing us a picture of what the space looked like. On our next map, we have a pictorial map with less detail. If we can get over, there we go, to the next slide. And it's, depending on the size of your computer screen, it may still look like it has a lot of detail. But one nice thing about this map, whenever I'm able to, if I'm going into a classroom, I print this on like an 11 by 17 piece of paper. And on that size of paper, it does not look really crowded. We have these like blank spaces between other things that makes it a little bit easier to navigate. Some of the details are still a bit hidden, but overall it's a bit simpler. This is a map that shows a plan of the Battle of Brooklyn, and it's really fun to look at because it shows the ships down at Gravesend Bay with the British pulling up down there, and it kind of charts the narrative story of the Battle of Brooklyn in a way that when we're talking about the American Revolution and the Battle of Brooklyn, we can provide this as a source to talk about that event in a different way than our textbook might tell us the story. So we love pictorial maps. Let's take a look at the next one. This next slide shows us an insurance map. Often insurance maps are published as atlases. So if we're talking about map vocabulary with our students, an atlas is a great word to talk about because an atlas is a book of maps. Insurance maps show us buildings, streets. They often show transportation routes as well. They might show sewer systems. Again, hard to see depending on the size of computer screen you're looking at this on, but the lines in the middle of streets here are actually showing us the dimensions of the pipes running through underground. And the different colors on this map give us a great opportunity to then use the key and talk about how the colors symbolize different types of building materials. For myself, as someone who loves maps, I love insurance maps, but I have handed them to students and seen panic on their faces when they see a lot more symbols than they feel comfortable being confronted with at once. And Stacy, your comment on the chat is really true. We want to start by talking about basic map features and the vocabulary that will help us talk about maps. And then the next type of map that I have here, the last main example I'm going to highlight today is really a kind of a themed map. And like Maggie was showing us when we started navigating the maps portal, we could navigate that portal by topic. This is a map that really relates to a specific topic. It's a map that was designed to show traffic, major traffic arteries in New York City. This is clearly not showing absolutely everything. It's not showing the buildings like it did on our last map, but it's showing us issues around traffic that we can then have conversations about. And it lets us have these conversations about why was this map made? And like we've asked already today, who maybe made this map? So we want to talk a little bit more about using maps in discussing a certain topic. But before we do that, just looking at the next slide, we have some questions to think about when choosing maps to use with your class. So think about whether your students have interacted with any type of map in the past. Have your students had conversations already about the difference between streets, neighborhoods, and cities? And a lot of you are adding in the chat the types of components of a map that you like to highlight. Definitely. We want to make sure we have these conversations about map vocabulary, map features before we really dive in. And does your class list any students with different learning abilities, including, and we didn't finish typing that slide, my apologies, but let's try out what we can see on one specific map. So we'll take a look at the next slide, and I'm doing a thing to you here where I'm not giving you the link to zoom in. All right, we are just looking at this map as large as it can appear on the screen you're looking at. I am using a very tiny computer screen at the moment, so I'm not seeing a ton of detail, but there are a few things that stand out to me. So when you look at this map to start with, we're gonna use those skills Julia shared with us in the icebreaker. What do you observe when you look at this map? What things stand out to you? What do you notice first? Okay, so we have an irregular shape. There's no compass. A lot of different color bands. I wonder what they mean. Awesome, thanks for kicking us off with a question. Colors, blocks of color, color coding. I love that you're noting the colors. Various kinds of boundaries. You see a title, fantastic. Anything else stand out? Street grids, maybe. Fancy typeface. No bridges. Okay, I think I see the compass now. Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember where I thought I saw it on here too, but it was a little bit light. Waterways, fantastic. Thanks, Kim. You see Flatbush, great. Williamsburg, yeah, it says map of Williamsburg. Super. We're going to go to the next slide and we'll get a little bit of a hint. Because on the next slide, I've actually provided the title of the map. It says Map of the City of Brooklyn and Village of Williamsburg, showing the size of blocks and width of streets as laid out by the commissioners, the old farm lines, water line, and all recent changes in streets. And it's from 1846. So, oh, and I love Laura's point, the shape is a little bit like a butterfly. Yeah, it's true. So based on your observations and also what we learned from this title, what would you infer that this map was created and or used for? Any ideas? Remember, this title says it's a map of the city of Brooklyn and the village of Williamsburg, showing the size of blocks, the width of streets, the old farm lines, the water line, and all recent changes in streets. And we have some ideas. Maybe it's used for town planning. Tori says maybe it's a cadastral map, so a map showing property. And Latanya echoes that: property borders, development or planning, creating main roads. All right, we've got some good ideas here. Now, when we talk about maps, we love to pull maps into discussion of any topic. Maps aren't something that we need to just use on their own. And so we're going to take a look at some context for this map. We'll go to the next slide. We're going to read two excerpts. One from the 1777 Constitution of New York and one from the 1821 Constitution of New York. And we'll share afterwards the link to the lesson plan material that this is from. This is actually from the In Pursuit of Freedom curriculum developed by Brooklyn Historical Society. But as I'll read these out, as we read them, I want you to reflect how have the voter requirements changed from the Constitution of 1777 to the Constitution of 1821 for white men? And how have voter requirements changed from the Constitution of 1777 to the Constitution of 1821 for Black men? I'm actually going to put those questions in the chat so that you can think about them as I read. Where are my questions here? Here we go. And let's look first at the 1777 Constitution of New York. And I'll read it out here. This is just an excerpt. That every male inhabitant of full age who shall have personally resided within one of the counties of the state for 6 months immediately preceding the day of election shall, at such election, be entitled to vote for representatives of the said county in assembly. If, during the time aforesaid, he shall have been a freeholder or property owner, possessing a freehold, land, of the value of 20 pounds, which would be about $100, within the said county, or have rented a tenement therein of the yearly value of 40 shillings, and have been rated and actually paid taxes to the state. Provided always that every person who is now a freeman of the state of Albany, or who was made a freeman of the city of New York on or before the 14th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1775, shall be actually and usually a resident of the said cities, respectively, shall be entitled to vote for representatives in assembly within his said place of residence. Now, I know that this is not necessarily language that we use to talk a lot about voting and land today. I'll actually put the link to a PDF of this in the chat if you prefer to follow along on a PDF on your own screen. But I'll just read again the first few lines of this, and before we go to the next one. That every male inhabitant of full age who shall have personally resided within one of the counties of the state for 6 months immediately preceding the day of election shall, at such election, be entitled to vote for representatives of the said county in assembly, if during the time aforesaid he shall have been a freeholder. All right. Let's take a look now at the 1821 excerpt on the next slide. Okay. Every male citizen of the age of 21 years who shall have been an inhabitant of the state 1 year preceding any election, and for the last 6 months a resident of the town or county where he may offer his vote, shall have within the next year preceding the election paid a tax to the state or county assessed upon his real or personal property, shall be entitled to vote in the town or ward where he actually resides and not elsewhere, for all officers that now are or hereafter may be elected by the people. But no man of color, unless he shall have been for 3 years a citizen of this state, and for 1 year next preceding any election, shall be seized and possessed of a freehold estate of the value of $250 over and above all debts and encumbrances charged thereon, and shall have been actually rated and paid a tax thereon, shall be entitled to vote at any such election. And no person of color shall be subject to direct taxation unless he shall be seized and possessed of such real estate as aforesaid. Now, I know that there's a lot of wording here that is not super familiar, not how we talk and read today. However, thinking back on those questions from before, let's take a look at the next slide. Any overall thoughts? Anything stand out to you? How have the voter requirements changed from the Constitution of 1777 to the Constitution of 1821 for white men? And how have they changed for Black men? And Wendy notes, it's glaringly apparent that people of color, Black males very specifically, were disenfranchised, right? So we saw language inserted to specify that they had to own property of even higher value. And what other things do you notice about what is needed just in order to vote? Brianna mentions, this is a reminder of all the ways Black people and people of color were disenfranchised. Lesser requirements over time for white males and more for Black males. Tori notes that you need property to vote. Richard, yeah, can we go back to the previous slide again? Sure, the 1821. And if you're looking for that text as well, you can access it through the link in the chat. Kim notes that property rights were an added hurdle. And thinking through our reflection questions again, we've mentioned this a little bit in the chat, but what are the consequences of this amendment? I love Stephen's point. You need residence by a freehold or an adequate rental in a very particular place in order to vote in that place. So we need maps to determine this. Let's go to my next slide. We're back at this map we were looking at. And remember, this is a map of the city of Brooklyn and the village of Williamsburg, showing the size of blocks and the width of streets is laid out by the commissioners. Farm lines are property lines. Water lines, recent changes in the streets. So based on what we know now, what do you think that this map might have been used for? And why do you think that maps like this would indicate property ownership? Yeah, Mignon, thanks. Thanks for pointing out, maps are going to be used to help us understand who can vote, who owns enough property. We want to get that, if you want to vote, you want to get your name as a property owner onto a map. And so, oh yeah, sure, can we get a link to the map? Yeah, absolutely. If you want to take a closer look, zooming in on the map, you can do that over here. Now, following reading these excerpts from the Constitution with students, I would invite them to brainstorm together. We're going to look at our brainstorm on the next slide. We won't take a lot of time on it today, but I think this is something that could be a really great classroom activity to give students a lot of time to work together in groups or to write their own individual reflection. Imagine that it is 1838 and you are a group of Black land investors in Brooklyn who are frustrated with voter discrimination and racial hostilities. After the Panic of 1837, property prices have been tumbling, and it has come to your attention that wealthy white landowners are selling off large estates that they can no longer afford. Brainstorm how you would work together to help other free Blacks acquire property and gain full citizenship. For example, pooling resources together to buy and sell off plots of land to Black families seeking the means to vote. Is that something that you would start with? Or what other ideas would you come up with? We'll just take 2 or 3 minutes, think to yourself what you might want to do. And if you have an idea, you can go ahead and share it in the chat. Kelly, I love your point in the chat, create Weeksville. And this is where we're heading. Absolutely. Anyone else have any other ideas? Stephen has a great question. Do the state of New York acknowledge cooperative ownership? That I am not entirely certain of. It's a great question. I don't know if anyone else has any info on acknowledgement of cooperative ownership, especially at that point in time. I'm not sure. And to be honest, I'm not sure what what the laws were around how cooperative ownership was even documented at that point in time. And yeah, Muriel echoed Weeksville. And so Weeksville is a fantastic thing to talk about with students. Weeksville is a community that was established in what we now think of as Brooklyn, the Crown Heights, Northern Crown Heights area of Brooklyn. And this is an area where a group of wealthier Blacks bought up property and sold off parcels to other Black landowners to make sure that they could then have the right to vote. So let's take a look at our next slide. And this is a tricky map to look at. This is a map that I would not just hand to students in the classroom and expect them to feel incredibly comfortable with. I'm putting a link to this one in the chat so you also can take a look at it in your browser if you want to zoom in more. I personally find this map a little tricky to work with because it's hard to orient myself. I don't see cardinal lines to show me what direction is what. I recognize some of the street names, but they don't look how I want them to look. But what's exciting to me is that when we're talking about the issue of Black property ownership and the importance of Black property ownership in this period following amendments to the Constitution, this map takes on new light because this is a map showing the area around Hunterfly Road, which I would give my students the context that Hunterfly Road is in the area we know today as Weeksville. And I apologize, I can't share my screen to zoom in on this. I'm still working with some sketchy internet this morning. But the area where the mouse is over towards the right is where we see Hunterfly Road. And this is an area that was bought up by wealthier property owners. So when we look at a map that is showing property ownership, we call that a cadastral map. What stands out to you about just looking in that kind of center area of the map? Is it, if we think about this as one block, oh, I think Charlie's gonna zoom in for us. Oh, maybe not. We're back on the map. Thanks, Charlie. If we look in just that one block area, is it, do you see a lot going on? Do you see not much going on? What stands out to you about that area? Feel free to share in the chat. Personally, I see a ton of little writing that's actually a little confusing to me. And we've got, I think we have the link in the chat. Oh. Sorry about that. I'll get the slide back up. We actually, over in this kind of lower right portion, we have a ton of little dotted lines, straight lines, little names written in very tiny print. And like LaTanya says, these are property owner names. It's complicated. Thank you, Mignon. I find it very complicated to look at this map. Why would it be so complicated? Because this land is being divided up into as many sections as possible to give as many people as possible a section of it, as many people who can afford to buy in. And so when I first look at this map and I think, oh, this is complicated, this is maybe a little bit difficult to access, it becomes really exciting after I read through the changes to the Constitution to realize, oh, this is an example of Black property owners getting together and all getting their names on the map somehow so that they could then become voters. And so sometimes even when we have these difficult maps, when we bring them into other topics of discussion, we find new ways to access the content, and we find new ways to bring them alive. But let's take a look at our next and last slide for this. I would love to hear from you what questions you think your students would ask when they looked at a map like this one, and what could make it more accessible. Daniel, I love your point of geo-referencing on a present street grid. I think it would also be really exciting to take students to the area that this represents, which is right around the Weeksville Heritage Center. And then we would be able to be in the space. Going there with classes is a lot of fun. And then having a conversation about what we see on the map versus what we see around us. And Muriel, yeah, thanks for this point. I think we want to connect maps with other sources to develop critical thinking. And I think that just looking at maps and learning to read maps for map literacy is really critical. But I get so excited when I realize that maybe the best source for an entirely like non-geographic topic is actually a map. And I think that this map illustrates some of the issues around voter disenfranchisement and the creation of Weeksville in a way that other sources might not. All right. So we're getting close to our time to wrap up. I would love to just take a few minutes to check in if anyone has any other questions. We'll be sharing all of these links and resources via email afterwards, along with the session recording. But any other questions or any other ideas you have about how you like to use maps with your students? Kim, I love your comment in the chat that using the expression on the map really takes on a new meaning with this. And Latanya mentioned, do you have any particular tips for using maps with different age groups? Yeah, I think, and I'll let Julia speak to this a little as well. With students who need more support, which will often be younger learners as well, we love starting with pictorial maps that show a lot less information. One of our favorite ones I realized actually didn't show up well on a slide, so I didn't put it up. But it's a pictorial map that shows the olden town of Brooklyn, circa 1840. And it has like crabs and stuff in the ocean, and like there's a literal like dragon devil over on New Jersey. Kids love that. And like Muriel's pointed out, the artistry part of maps might be a factor of attraction. We really find on these pictorial maps that those artistic details of seeing like crabs in the ocean, or like the Battle of Brooklyn one, seeing the boats down by Gravesend Bay, showing the British coming up, are something that really hooks students. For students who maybe need a little bit more of a challenge, giving them multiple maps to compare is really fun. Maybe maps that show the same place over time, maybe 50 or 100 years apart, is a really great exercise, because of course those maps are not going to be exactly the same. They're not going to have the exact same boundaries, and so it'll force students to kind of do the layering that we've been talking about and wishing that all of our software could do. And so that really challenges their map literacy skills, and it also gives them the opportunity to be very critical thinkers, thinking about what has changed, what might have caused those changes to occur, and what critical questions they want to ask. And then Kim notes students can make maps of their school and or classrooms and could be a guide for new students and parents. Absolutely. I worked with a class of students who made a map of their school, and it was amazing because they made a key that was not like a key I've ever seen on a map. It was, to be honest, more useful. And it was color coded based on like the kinds of things or like the way they felt in different parts of the school. It was really, really beautiful. So I think that giving students the opportunity to be map makers is a really important part of it as well, and can build on these questions of why maps are made and who makes them. But Julia, do you have any other suggestions for types of maps?
Yeah, for sure. So let me just start off by saying that I legitimately never thought I would say this out loud, but one of my favorite archival sources that we have is a map, and it's the map that Jen was talking about before. It's called Ye Olde Brooklyn, and I am obsessed with this map because it's beautiful, right? There's a lot of things that are going on and a lot of things that you can relate to, right? So for me, like I said before, I get really overwhelmed and kind of stressed out when I look at certain depictions of maps. But for this one, again, you're seeing the water and you're seeing crabs and lobsters, right? And you're seeing like beautiful lettering that say, "Here be lobsters," right? You're seeing railway tracks, you're seeing houses and churches, you're seeing all of these neighborhoods that I can associate with, like new lots and things like that. So when I do show this to kids, right, I love doing this, especially when I teach in places like East New York, which is near New Lots. The kids automatically recognize the church, right? The kids automatically recognize New Lots, right? But then they immediately have questions about, okay, so what's going on with this like weird dragon? What's going on with this mermaid? What's going on with this really big, weird mosquito-like creature that's happening? So when you're looking at this map, automatically, again, they're relating to a place that they know on the map, like New Lots. We show them the place where they are right now, like in the library, right? And so again, they're having these two kind of locations. But you can take that exercise and do it in a bunch of different ways. Again, making your observations, inferences, and questions. You can then take it and do a writing prompt, right? So you can say, okay, well, we've listed things that we see. We've listed these weird questions that we want answers to. Write a paragraph or write a few sentences of what you think life would have been like when this map was created, right? What was this person trying to accomplish by including this specific shipwreck, right? And so again, you can kind of access all of this information, but in a writing prompt or a journal entry, right? Which is really fun. I've had teachers tell me that they use primary source journals where they include like little maps in, and like every Friday they do a little like writing prompt about that. So that's just like a nice way to use maps, where they cut out a picture of a map, they kind of paste it into their notebook, and they literally just free write about everything that they want to know about the map. So I think that there are a bunch of different ways to incorporate maps. But kind of like the do now questions that we had before, you're taking your maps that might be a little difficult and just relate it to them. So ask them, if you're going to do a map of your house, or you're going to do or draw a map of your favorite place, what would it look like, right? So I've asked that questions to kids before, and they're like, it would be my refrigerator because that's where all my ice cream is. Okay, great. So like, what else would you want to include? Why is that important? So again, just trying to make it fun and engaging, and kind of mixing it up has always kind of led to really fun conversations.
And a few folks asked for a link to that chat, that map. So I've just put it in the chat. It's not in the Maps portal. It's in the Brooklyn Public Library digital collections. I know somewhere else to explore. We really like using that one as well. And Muriel mentioned maps can be a great platform for students to show knowledge. In 5th grade one year, we recreated the Gowanus area to show how this area could be transformed into a future environmental dreamland with a clean Gowanus canal. And I love this as well, maps for imagining what we want. There is a map that we have in our collection over at the Brooklyn Public Library that is, it was a map that was created in 1903, and it was the Brooklyn of the future. And so not everything that is on that map came true, Also, they imagined that in the Brooklyn of the future, there would still be like nobody living in Canarsie. And I love showing that map to students from Canarsie because they can verify that it is not correct. So it gives us a great opportunity to talk about what the point is of keeping maps that are not true. And of also talking about how we can use maps to imagine the world that we want to live in. So many great and exciting ideas for maps today. Thank you for being here. I think it's time for us to wrap up, but I would love to invite you, if you enjoyed being with us today, we'd love to invite you to come back. We have a lot of really terrific workshops coming up. And this first one we wanted to highlight, the COVID-19 crisis has made the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic a lot more relevant than we ever expected. So we've invited Kenneth Davis to join us on February 9th to share about his research for his book, More Deadly Than War, The Hidden History of the Spanish Flu. We've just put the registration link for that in the chat. And if you are looking for a way to virtually support, let's see what's on the next slide, students doing place-based research where they are, we're going to be sharing some ideas and strategies for that, place-based learning to explore local history on March 10th. And then to follow up on the workshop with Kenneth Davis on February 9th, we have a curriculum workshop on March 16th where we will be looking at primary sources and reading lists to help us learn more about modern medicine in Brooklyn. When we talk about modern, we're talking about like the whole 20th century. So, you know, don't think it's too modern. We're still really diving into history. And then we are really excited about an event with friends from Greenwood Cemetery coming up on March 18th. And I'll put the link for that in the chat. They will be joining with us to talk about the buried history of Margaret Pine, re-examining a life and a gravesite. And we've had some really great conversations today in this workshop about critical thinking. This will be a workshop for thinking about critical thinking and thinking about how history tells one narrative of a person, but we can actually look at primary source material, even the tiny bit that we have, to understand a completely different narrative about someone. And in this case, about an enslaved person who may not have had the opportunity to record a lot of her own thoughts and feelings about herself, but we're going to think critically about how we can re-examine the sources that were created about her life to rewrite the narrative that was written for her. And then if you are looking for exciting ways to get your students involved with project-based learning this year, we are very excited to be hosting New York City History Day this year. Registration for that is open right now as well, and so that you can find links in the chat to find out more. And Kelly asked if we can share this list of recommended events so it's easier to share with others. Absolutely, this will all be in the email that you get afterwards. Don't worry. Lots of links coming at you, and feel free to share these with your colleagues, your friends. We know that teaching online and learning online together is very different than maybe we are used to and necessarily comfortable with, but we're so excited to be able to connect with all of you still through these online platforms, and we really hope to see more of you. And then finally, I know many of you would like CTLE credit. And so to get CTLE credit for today, we have a survey. I put the link in the chat and it is also on the screen. So if you're looking for CTLE credit, you'll be able to submit info for that at the end of this survey. So in the survey, you can generally just give us feedback on this event, but you can also share your details to get CTLE credit, and you'll get your CTLE paperwork from us in the next 2 weeks via email. Fantastic. And we will hang around here for a few more minutes in case there are any other questions. But in the meantime, thanks for coming. Feel free to fill in your survey, log off, go enjoy the snow. Yeah, just I will put that link for the survey in the chat one more time.